Hi, and welcome everybody to the talk, where today we're actually going to be diving really deep into building capacity for vulnerable and marginalized communities. Most of us who are in the social sector are working with, communities that are vulnerable in some manner, come from low income strata, and don't really have access to a lot of basic necessities like education, healthcare, or even awareness around basic things. Now, a little bit about our studio before we actually jump into how do we build capacity, a little bit around how have we worked around this as well. So I lead the Social Innovation Studio, where our major vision is to actually make change by design. How we really do that is we collaborate with nonprofits, social enterprises, or basically any change maker out there, and we work on either research through a design perspective, whether it's qualitative research or whether it's monitoring and evaluation of the programs that they're running. Secondly, we actually design these interventions as well. Again, coming from a lens, if it's an existing intervention, how can we create more impact via the current intervention? What are some gaps that are still existing in that intervention? Or completely redesign or completely design a new intervention as well. Now, these interventions are actually across different genres. It could be a program, it could be a toolkit, it could be workshops of different kinds, it could be an amalgamation of a lot of things, or even if it's an app. So, when it comes from a design perspective, we're able to do end to end sort of a holistic approach from design perspective. A little bit about me. I'm actually a curious soul. I'm a social designer. My background has been in design from graduation as well as master's was in healthcare, master's of research from Imperial College. So far, I've actually delved deeper into system and intervention design, capacity building, and behavior design. Actually, the idea came in when you look at the world, and right now design is actually one of the key things. A lot of the most influential companies out there have gone design first, whether it's Apple, whether it's Tesla. You have innovations happening, things like Sophia, a human robot, is an innovation that's actually living amongst us. So imagine if design has taken us to such new heights, what it can do for the social sector. Now, back to our topic, which is building capacity for vulnerable and marginalized community. Let's go back to the basics, which is, what is capacity building? When we think about capacity building right now, across you will look at a lot of people working on skills, trainings, but we really, even if you look at the definition, which talks about skills, instincts, abilities, processes, and resources. A lot of us touch upon skills, processes, and resources, but we really forget about the instinct part. And here, again, if you look at the definition, it talks about, organizations and communities, these various skills, instincts, abilities, processes, and resources are needed not just to survive, but to adapt and thrive. And again, given the approach that most of us are taking, we're barely able to enable survival. So, what is it that really is an hindrance, and why aren't we able to approach it holistically? Firstly, when we talk about information, now we're living in an era where lack of information is not really true because everybody has access to mobile phone with basic internet, which means they can Google it. And a lot of people do. So where are the challenges coming in terms of information? So the first basic challenge we realized was complex information, which is, for example, in the healthcare sector, we're training a lot of people to be able to do basic healthcare services for their communities. But we have to keep in mind that they're not coming from a medical background, and probably they've not even done their graduation, a lot of them. So, how do you break such complex information to your community? That is one lens that we have to look at. Secondly, although they have access to technology, a lot of them do not know how to use it. Basic usage has become very common, but again, in terms of how to navigate an app or how to even pick up on certain trends that are going around is still a huge gap. Thirdly, a lot of us are talking about guidance, and we have experts that are on our panels. But hand holding and consistent guidance, again, is one of the key gaps that is missing. Lastly, again, in terms of lack of support and soft skills, in support, we have resources, people who are available to them, but what about the emotional and motivational? Right? And this stands true for even all humans. It's very difficult to do a lot of things without support, whether it's emotional support or motivational support. So these were some challenges that we have realized in our experience exist while we are building capacity for our communities that are from the lower income strata. Now, again, once we've looked at the challenges, so what does it mean when we look at capacity building and what are we really trying to build? So, what we're asking is, does your community have the physical and psychological abilities to participate? Again, like mentioned, skill is something a lot of us touch upon, which is physical abilities. In psychological, intellectual is partly touched upon, where we are delivering information, but it may not be comprehended, which means it's not a holistic approach again. And emotional and social are rarely touched upon when we look at it from an overall perspective. So, how do we really make sure what we are doing is holistic? Firstly, making sure we understand where our audience is and starting where they are and things they are comfortable with. Secondly, making sure that to be able to fill that gap, we have provided them the guided and holistic support, and there is hand holding to be able to create the envisioned impact that we have in our minds. Now, how do we again do that? We have the formula, but what does it really mean to dive deeper into it and actually implement this formula? So, first, like we mentioned, it's time to understand and identify our community. A lot of these frameworks may not be new, but there are certain aspects that we miss out on while we're doing this persona. And what we're actually going to be talking about throughout the workshop is the lenses that really help you to make sure that the process that you're following is giving you the right results. You are able to validate that the frameworks that you are using are relevant and the results are relevant. So, when we again come back to understanding and really identifying our community, first we touch upon user persona, then we look at defining goals for them, and lastly, we understand their ecosystem and the relationship that they have with their ecosystem. So let's start with the user persona. Here we've created a reference for you. Before we actually jump through this, we've put in references from actually our personal work. So the case study that we're going to be taking is actually with a collaboration, and we're working with a nonprofit called Plus Trust, where we actually work with women who are from rural parts of the world. They reached out to us when they realized that although medical training is being provided, they're unable to create the impact that they've envisioned. And the impact that they'd actually envisioned was for these women to be able to provide healthcare services to their communities and also become independent and earn money from it. So now, coming back to the user persona with keeping this context in mind, we started doing a little bit of research. And I cannot emphasize enough on research and including your participants in the entire process. Research actually helps us stay connected to our community and the people and helps us evolve faster as well. So here, when we created these user personas, we had a couple of calls, actually a lot of calls, interviews, FGDs and surveys that were sent out to get an understanding. Now your insights will also vary from demographic to demographic. Here, one reference that we've taken is of a rural woman from Ujjain. Now, again, if you look at it, when we spoke of the lenses that are important, based on the context that we'd set in terms of personality, these are the 5 key personality traits it was important for us to understand where these women lie in, which was how aware are they of healthcare services and medical information in general. Secondly, how motivated are they to do this? Thirdly, how much authority do they have in their society to be able to actually create that change? Fourth, superstitious beliefs, because we found when it comes to, again, lower income strata, vulnerable and marginalized communities, there are a lot of practices which may not be advocated by experts, but still happen. So it is again important to keep that lens because you would be addressing that behavior as you go along in your intervention. And the last aspect you see here, social, because again, they had to go out and interact in their communities. So if they don't have social capabilities, it's a huge gap in terms of what we want them to do and what their current actions would be like. So again, here, going back to, it's very important to understand whose capacity we're building in and where they really are before we start where they are. Once we've defined the user persona, the second thing that we actually do is define goals for them. So here the lens that again comes in, or the question that you ask yourself would be, what do you want to enable and empower for your community, right? So as I've already set the context, for us, it was we wanted to help women create stable source of income for themselves while providing healthcare services to their communities. Once you've defined your goal, the next thing actually you move on to is mapping the ecosystem. Now, the first layer is something most of us are able to do, which is how or who really influences our target audience. But what we forget is mapping the relation. Here, to make it simpler, we've just put in two lenses, which is, who enables our community and who is an hindrance in terms of implementation to our community. So again, in our reference, when we put down these women, we knew enablers were their kids, their families, some of their friends. So these were key enablers we were able to identify. And again, when we looked at hindrance, so panchayat was a hindrance, or even in terms of healthcare services, because it was so far for them, whether it was ambulance services, or whether, for example, it was the superstitious beliefs like chola chap doctors, or just the elders in their society who are giving unsolicited advice in terms of healthcare services being provided. So these were actually disruptors in terms of the larger picture, which is better health for the society. Again, the reason you do this is because you keep in mind as you go ahead, are there some very, very concrete disruptors that you'd want to address in terms of making them their enablers? Or is there any enabler you could introduce in your intervention that would make the entire intervention more effective? That's the reason not just identifying people, but also identifying their relation is important. And in this case, if you'd like, you could always dive deeper, which is you could also look at how are they enabling our community. Is it because they have huge influence? Is it because they're motivating them? Is it because there's blind trust? Again, if you go to this level, you're able to immediately identify how this stakeholder would impact my member or my community if I introduce them in the overall picture. So this was the first key step where we actually understood our audience. So what we've really done is firstly understand them by creating a persona. Secondly, we actually dwell deeper into the defining goals for them. So we have this lens and everything that happens is happening in this order. And lastly, we've understood their ecosystem and how our communities are influenced by these ecosystems. Once we've done this, the second thing that we really need to be working on is identifying capacity gaps and needs. So here we are actually able to understand, okay, now I have an overall goal for me, but how do I really build their capacity, or in what do I really build their capacity? So again, this is inspired by a behavior change model called COMBI. Anybody who wants to look it up can just look it up and dive deeper. Here we've simplified it for our context, which is capacity building. So here the three main things that we look at is our community's capabilities, our community's motivation, and thirdly, opportunities that are provided to them and additional opportunities that we could provide to them. So let's dive deeper into the first one, which is capability gaps. So here, now I go back to my goal. I know that I want to be able to enable and empower women to be able to provide healthcare services and be able to earn from it. So what capabilities does my community need? Here, the reference that we've put down, A, medical information retention. From the medical training, we knew that they had access to the information, but A, they were not able to retain it, and B, it was very complex for them to understand. So we knew that was one key aspect where there was a capability gap. Secondly, we knew there had to be business training done because, again, even if you do give them the entire medical information in terms of how to serve your community, does not mean they know how to actually set up their own practice or even venture out into, let's say, keeping multiple products that their communities would use. Basic products like this could be sanitary napkins, it could be pregnancy tests, it could be basic medication that you use on a daily basis, it could be something like Eno. So even if you do want to be selling this to your community and actually earning a living out of it, you would need to know how to set up your business. Thirdly, we realized that these women are so amongst themselves and so within the house that interaction with the community was also a gap for most of them. Lastly, interacting with any stakeholder beyond just their community that they're serving was also a capacity that needed to be built. Whether it was hospitals, whether it was pharmacies, because ultimately, when you're talking about health, if somebody does go to them, you'd want to look at it from an end to end perspective where they're able to take it ahead and connect them with the right people in terms of treatment. Similarly, other stakeholders, if you look at the business perspective, if I want to sell something, I would want to connect with the supplier, I would want to know about the inventory. So, how do I talk to those people and actually get the job done? So, these are also some capability gaps that we've mentioned here for better understanding, irrespective of the problem you're trying to solve or the gap that you're trying to fill. The question you would ask yourself again is, what capabilities does my community need to achieve the goal that I've set or envisioned? Moving ahead, we look at motivation gaps. And again, here we look at it from two lenses, which means what really accelerates my community's motivation and what again is a hindrance to my community's motivation. From the reference or the case study that we're talking about, when we looked at accelerating, we realized, the one question we asked them was, why are you doing this? Which really helps you understand anybody's motivation. So, in terms of acceleration, we realized A, it was majorly their kids. B, it was something purpose driven where they actually wanted to be able to make a difference. Or three, it was related to personal aspirations like I want to be in a certain position or I want to be able to have a monthly income of so and so amount in the next 1 year, in the next 2 years. Secondly, you also look at it from a perspective, what is really hindering my community's motivation? So what is coming in way for my community to be able to achieve the goals or to even participate in the goal that we've set? So from that lens, again, we realized patriarchy was a key hindrance where they were looked down upon, whether it was in panchayat, they did not have a say. And again, that led to low self-confidence. Now, here, one thing to keep in mind is we're not looking at it from a perspective that we'd want to solve everything. Let's take example of the patriarchal situation. Patriarchy is not something that you'd be able to solve through one intervention. It's a really layered, complex, and wicked problem. But the idea is that you're aware of this happening and the intervention that you introduce is not overly ambitious as well. So you're aware of the friction that is coming in and you're able to design your interventions around this. Once we've defined the motivation gap, next you ask yourself, as an organization, what more opportunities can we create for the community? Now you've realized where the capacity gaps are by now. You've realized, what is hindering their motivation or emotional state. So what are some processes and resources that I could include in the program or in the intervention that I've designed, which would actually help them accelerate whatever they're trying to do? Again, coming back to our case study, in terms of opportunity, we realized we could give them more handy and easy to understand information. Secondly, like we've been talking about, we could help handhold them throughout this journey for a little while. And thirdly, enable peer-to-peer support. So this again is a very comprehensive version of the entire intervention that we've designed to be able to connect and help you out as we go along. All of these would be very different based on the community that you address to, based on the demographic that you're looking at, and based on the goal that you've defined for yourself. Now, once you've defined your capability gaps, what motivates or demotivates your audience, and what are some spaces of opportunity for you to be able to intervene, we move on to the next step, which essentially is brainstorming solutions. So, this is the space where you'd be actually able to design yourself a model where you address all of the gaps that we spoke of. Before you even jump onto brainstorming the solutions, you start with key gaps that you really have to sort of work on. And again, this comes in with a lens of what capabilities or what gaps are most important for my community this point if we would solve those. So again, here it is not an organization lens, it's a more community driven lens. So when we again had a conversation, I'm going to again repeat the importance of including our community in this entire process. So here how we again went ahead about this was through research. We'd send out regular surveys, and even more than surveys, we found individual calls really helped, because if you've already done your basic research initially, you've already connected with them, and you've already worked on creating a safe space. So after that, if you keep reaching out to them, now this can happen in any manner. It could be through WhatsApp, it could be through scheduled online video calls where you're doing group feedback or group sort of research. And these are very short calls that we have done. So we adhere to personal calls and WhatsApp messages. There we were able to get a lot of responses. And what we realized again was the key capabilities that we needed to address: A, medical information retention; two, low self confidence; and third, interaction within the women community who had joined these programs. So when we knew these were the three key things, again, what are some solutions we could do? So next we moved on to brainstorming the solutions. Here we've just taken one reference, but when you're brainstorming, this is actually the space where you begin with going limitless. You do not think about feasibility at this aspect. Feasibility comes into the later aspect where we start thinking of implementation and shortlisting ideas. But when you're brainstorming, the first thing you do is, okay, now these are the gaps. How do I solve it? The reference here we've taken is medical information retention, to be able to walk you through the process that we really do. Now, the two lenses that we look at it. Firstly, what are some ways I can build the identified capacity? Which is, what are some ways for us? It was, what are some ways we could actually help women retain the medical information? We realized we could do a lot of interactive content. So whether it was story, comic, quizzes, these were some initial ideas that we'd worked on. Second, and again, equally important lens is, how can I keep my community motivated throughout? Now, the reason this is very, very important is because you're looking at creating sustainable impact, right? And even if you take a step back and look at your personal life, what is one habit you were able to retain without motivation? Very little, right? Exactly the reason you'd want to be able to interact with your community and keep them motivated throughout. So now again, when we looked at how could we do this, we realized we could keep sharing aspirational and conversational content, A, which would help them connect within their community, and B, it would constantly keep fueling their dreams. So once, let's say, we have this approach, how we did it, here's like a view. So we started creating comics. First thing that you see is again a comic of somebody who's fainted and two CHEs, or two women who are a part of this intervention, having a conversation as to what is the right approach. Again, this was a very popular content piece that went out from our end, where it was fun, interactive, and the women really enjoyed going through it and actually retained the information. Second, what you see is MCQ. This is also done on WhatsApp, because start where they are. And here we would give them options that they would respond to. At this stage, we have things like poll that WhatsApp easily gives us. So that is also something that you could use to your advantage. Here on the right, the three images that you see are aspirational content, where we'd give them prompts that they would respond to. So as you can see on the right most, we have two collaterals that we delivered, and on the left is actually an interaction between the CHEs themselves. The tiny things that you could look at here, the heart reactions, all of this has been built in terms of capacity as we went along. So our community managers would send out voice note prompts, take screen recordings and actually send them to show how they could respond and would actually actively engage. Again, key part being there's somebody who's nudging them constantly, which is us in the organization. Now, again, once you have brainstormed and figured out what are the key things that we need to do, the second thing that you really need to focus on is identifying mediums. And this is where feasibility comes in for you as well. So, now going back a little, you've realized where you need to build capacity, you've brainstormed solutions. Now you see what has happened, what you need to do, what is the gap, how you need to solve it. Now you come to where do I solve it? So again, here you have limitless options, online and offline. First way of filtering your mediums or your channels would be understanding and going back to your community and understanding what are their preferences or what are their daily modes of communication. So have they even heard of Zoom? Have they ever used Zoom? Do they use SMS or do they still use WhatsApp? Have they ever used an app? So when you're looking at it from an online perspective, these are things that you'd go through. And if there is a question mark in any of this, like we mentioned, just go back to your community and just take a poll. Within minutes, you will have your answer right there. Secondly, what is feasible for us to implement? So here is the lens of the feasibility, which means, I could say that I want to put up like a Broadway show, but is it feasible for me to put up a Broadway show or a theater at this point? Or would it be easier for me to do flyer? So when you look at the feasibility, you also look at basically how much impact would it have versus how much effort do you need to put in. So when we did this for us, the key thing that came in was we would not be able to attend to such large communities across India offline, which meant our budgets would go higher, our efforts would go higher, because we wanted this to be a reoccurring thing. So then we looked at online models and we looked at what were our community's preferences. We started with WhatsApp and we realized that for interactive things, we'd have to build their capacity for Zoom. So the two things that we picked up was one, WhatsApp, and the other thing was basically Zoom workshops that we held. Now, like I mentioned, Zoom was not something we introduced in the beginning. For the first couple of months, we only explored WhatsApp so that they were comfortable with that before we introduced another tool or resource for them to start using. One thing we realized was while we were building their capacity to use these mediums, it slowly started showing in their personality, and it also fueled the confidence that they had. Now, once you've identified your medium, for us, like I mentioned, it was WhatsApp and Zoom. Then the next bit you actually work on is the implementation strategy. So here, I want to deliver a story. I want to deliver a comic. I want to host a workshop on business model canvas. How do I really do it? A, I need a strategy to be able to do that. B, I need to be able to create a monthly and a weekly plan. C, I need to have a monitoring and evaluation strategy that will make sure that I'm evolving quickly, very relevant to my audience, as well as I'm creating a sustainable impact. So monitoring and evaluation again is very necessary because your community is growing day by day, right? They're learning new things, they're understanding different sort of things, which means you can't have a one-time strategy only. That's the reason monitoring and evaluation is again equally important as you introducing the strategy. So firstly, let's look at the first bit. Now, when you talk about implementation strategy, what it really means is what is your journey going to look like? On the left, it's a very comprehensive version of how we approach WhatsApp. On the right, there's a very comprehensive view of how we approach Zoom. So in terms of WhatsApp, we started with, firstly, you need topics and content from research. Secondly, because there's monitoring and evaluation, you would need to revisit your documentation and insight. Next, you would want to create a calendar. Next, you would want to actually refine the final content and add in the final content. And then you'd want to send it for design production. And then, of course, the implementation bit comes in. Another thing that we'd introduced, which at this point I'll not dive very deep into, but just briefly touch upon, is a leader intervention, which means let's take, for example, WhatsApp. If we are catering to these rural women, one thing we realized was that engagement while we were sending out posts was still not as high as we wanted them to be. So when we did one of the research and one of the feedback sessions, we realized that there was still some distance between us and them. They did not look at us as a part of the community. So again, there was this one statement that came up that you're coming in from a very different perspective. The statement that they used was, "Aapko kya pata, hamara life kya hai?" Which really struck home because it's true. Every community or even every human is experiencing life differently. So when we heard this, we realized immediately how much more involvement we needed from our community. That is where what we introduced was, like I mentioned, the leader initiative, where we changed the leader every 2 weeks. And these leaders are the ones who are actually posting the final content on WhatsApp. So even if we've designed a collateral, we get on a call with them firstly while planning the calendar. Secondly, we let them take the lead on posting. We send those to them. Initially, again, there was capacity building. So first time that we sent out for a leader to send out the post, we were on a call with them. Our community manager was on a call with them to actually give them context of how they could approach it, what kind of caption could they write. And moving ahead, they were so welcoming to the idea that we saw the impact within the week. After that, they actually started taking initiative and coming up to us and telling us what they wanted to learn. Like, for example, one thing that we'd missed out on was spoken English. So they actually came back to us and were like, what, we want to be able to have conversations in English. So can you send the collaterals that you send in Hindi as well as the same thing in English, and also use some basic English words with us while you're facilitating workshops so we could pick them up. And again, this has really created a sense of ownership. While they were doing all of this, they realized that, what, we have a say in what is happening or what we're really doing. So that entire conversation of, what do you know we go through, changed. The narrative completely changed. It became more about, how do we actually together do something that's better for us, which is exactly what we were aiming for. And that breakthrough accelerated the impact that we were creating drastically. On the right, what you see again, is our approach for Zoom workshop. Here, how we approached it was similar, but a little different because it had activities. So, firstly, we started with, what are some topics that we could address? What are some activities that we could do? And every workshop had three sort of major spaces. First was the icebreaker, where we'd make sure it was more interactive and like a game. Secondly, the main activity or the main topic that we're really addressing. And lastly, if there was any feedback we wanted from them, we would make sure we keep last 10 minutes for our feedback and any closing that we have. So that made sure that our monitoring and evaluation was not just one time thing, but it happened every time our workshop happened, which was twice a month, every alternate Wednesday. Then once this was designed, similar approach where we'd send it for production, where then we sit down on, how we would want to facilitate it, because that facilitation also really makes an impact. Initially, we started with a lot of dry runs. We started having conversations with them at the end where, even just workshop related feedback was taken. If there were, we also started noting down which conversation had high engagement, which conversation had taboos around it and women weren't able to talk about. So something like, gender discrimination. A lot of the women shied away from that conversation. And very interestingly, after 3 months, we were able to see them come up to us and talk about it so casually, as if, it was something they addressed, they saw. Even if they're not able to do anything about it, they started the conversation, not just within themselves, but also around the community, which was again a win that was not planned for, but happened slowly and gradually. After that, again, documentation is a key part. We'll talk about monitoring and evaluation in the next phases. But again, same thing where we document what is happening in each of the conversation, what is working, what is not working, how do we evolve this for the next month's strategy. And we'd also create certain documentation pieces. For example, if we have had a very fruitful or a meaningful conversation with somebody, we'd make sure we're able to make a note of that while the workshop was going on and while there was a person documenting it. So once you have your implementation strategy, For us, like I mentioned, in WhatsApp, we were doing content, and for workshops, it was more interactive ability building sessions where we touched upon emotional, social, as well as business aspect of things. Now, the next thing basically that you do is now you have an overall strategy of how you'd approach this, but you still need to be able to, like we said, keep going back to it, evolve it, and have a place to document it. So here again, what you see is just a small screenshot of how we do our monthly or weekly plan. Now, whether you're creating a monthly or a weekly plan would depend on your intervention or on your capacity building approach, which again would depend on the goal, the overall goal that you have. Now, in terms of WhatsApp, the interaction was weekly and it was a lot higher, but in terms of workshop, it was twice a month. So, what you see here, let's start with basically the workshop piece. We would host, or we would actually have weekly insights. We would divide it into, what type of content is it information, is it question prompt, is it capacity building in any manner, or is it a conversation prompt? This would again help us go back to our rich insights and understand what post is getting high engagement, what post is getting low engagement, is there a theme around it, or is there a day around it, what are the patterns that are actually working in our favor. Then we, based on the research content and the overall themes, we define topic. Whatever topic you choose has to be very relevant to what had happened last week. Hence, it is very important to maintain a monitoring and evaluation process. So again, if you know that right now my community is looking for information around menstruation, so then I'd want to address that. If there's a seasonal sort of disease or like an infection that's going around right now, I'd want to be able to address that. So hence we would do our weekly strategy, so it's easier for us to evolve as we go. Then you look at the medium you'd want to sort of take it ahead with. Some things work as infographic well, some things work as, again, a question prompts well, some things work more as video, some things work more as storytelling in format of comics. So that's where you look at it. And again, when you're defining medium, two lenses, not just what my community prefers, but in terms of efforts. So for us, we realized comics and overall stories take a lot longer than everything else. So we would only do one story a week, or one comic every 2 weeks. So once that was in place, we knew I have my calendar in place. I'm supposed to do one comic, which is the topic that would be most relevant. Again, video would take a little bit longer than a static post or a question prompt. So I would reverse engineer it, saying, capacity building infographics, question prompts, easier to do. Let's populate more of that. Also deliver stories. Also, so it's basically an amalgamation of what my community wants, what my community prefers, along with basically what is feasible for me as an organization as well to be able to deliver this. Once we've created a monthly and a weekly plan, the next bit that you see is for workshops as well, where we define goals for every workshop. We'd actually define activities for every workshop. So here, if you see, rapid fire is usually one of the key icebreakers we go with. Really sends around energies very quickly out in the room, makes them enthusiastic to be able to delve into complex problems or complex topics that we're going to touch upon. And then, of course, we include stories, and we create a lot of space for conversation where we leave the room open for them to share. So we have a lot of prompts as well while we're facilitating. So here again, we made sure whatever we were doing was implementation along with the entire information delivery. So for example, if we've picked up on business model canvas, we've spoken to them around, let's say, something as simple as suppliers. So how we approached it was, we actually gave them a template. We asked them to go out after we'd done that session, where the sheet had all of the columns they needed in terms of being able to implement it. So, products, they had listed products that the community was interested in. They asked individual prices of all of these. They asked them, if I were to buy in bulk, let's say if I were buying 50, if I were buying 20, what would the price be like? We asked them to take care of, how the transport transportation would look like, which means would the cost include the transportation for these products to my house, or would I have to come pick them up? Is there an easy way? Now, having said that, this was not enough. So we also helped them in the same session with role playing exercises, which means we'd give them situations that you are conversing with your supplier, and let's say right now your supplier is not budging from the price he said. What are some techniques you can use to actually negotiate and go ahead and implement this? So like we mentioned, it was a holistic approach. It wasn't just information delivery, but we made sure that they were actually going ahead and implementing it. So even though we had a monthly plan, or even though we have a monthly plan for our workshops, we keep reiterating and evolving based on where our community is and how we can enable them better. So for example, the supplier session ideally was supposed to be 2 sessions, but we had to take a third one because there were still certain confidence gaps, or people who were unable to implement that. So we made sure we were able to give them more room to go ahead and actually do that. We realized, like we mentioned, that in specific scenarios they would get stuck. So how do you go around it? What this also did was enable the community to peer support, where they shared all their resources. It created like a safe space for them as well. So if I have one supplier, I was able to reach out to a friend and be like, what, why don't the two of us have the same supplier and get it for a cheaper price together? So all of this happened because we had a monthly and a weekly plan, and we sort of stuck to monitoring and evaluation. Here's again a small glimpse of what monitoring and evaluation strategy we had. There's a detailed version in the sheet. Happy to take anybody through this later after the conversation. Feel free to reach out. But in terms of how in short we approached it, was we have individual monitoring and evaluation sheets. Like you saw here, we'd created these topics, or workshop goals and activities. After that, we have how many women engaged. So we have two things. We also put down number of women, so there are around 15 women in each workshop or each location that joins. We also put in the percentages, so that again gives us an understanding of, in terms of overall participation, what does it look like. Every activity has a response summary. So here what you see, engagement is not just workshop wise, but it is also activity wise per workshop. So what was the response summary, where you're basically talking about what had high engagement, what had low engagement. Now engagement was our success metrics. You could have your own success metrics as well. Once you've documented your response summary, there'd be some of the other insight that would sort of pitch in. So you note down all of those insights in here. So for example, this is something that was in the beginning. So fun activity was something that really had a lot of participation, or short time rapid fire questions were really, really high engaging. And again, once the ice was broken, the engagement kept getting better and better. So they were able to talk to us about difficult topics as well. Once you do have your insights, you move on to, now how do I incorporate this insight into my next week's strategy? So here we realized that a lot of the questions we're asking on Zoom for feedback, a lot of the women got influenced by others' answers. So let's say if I was talking about how confident do you feel right now, so we realized a lot of the women could not answer immediately, gauged and then thought about it and then answered. So one strategy we introduced after that is that, for these kind of questions, we could actually send out Google Forms, so they're not influenced by anybody else's answers. And we're able to get at least a real picture of what they think or where they think they're at. Similarly, now once we'd had, individual sheet for our workshop as well as WhatsApp group, we have a master insight sheet where we actually incorporate major insights from WhatsApp and workshop that we need for next strategy. So here, if you look at it, this is entire workshops insight, but you don't need to go through all of them all the time when you're designing your next month strategy. So it's easier to just filter it out in a master insight sheet where okay, I'm sitting down for my next month strategy. Here are the 5 insights that I know that I need to address to from WhatsApp group. Here are 5 insights I know I need to work on, from the workshops M&E sheet. And this is how now my next strategy will evolve based on this. This again obviously goes and feeds back into your monthly and weekly plan, where even if needed, you could introduce more columns, or you could, make it more comprehensive as well. One key thing to keep in mind is not to have an exhausting M&E sheet, because that means more of your time goes in M&E than planning, implementing. So try and keep making it as concise as possible as you keep going ahead each and each month. So even for us, our M&E sheet has actually evolved over time, from where initially, we just had WhatsApp. So it was very, very exhaustive in terms of the number of tabs we had. Then we introduced Zoom. So then, again, we realized we need to make it comprehensive. So then we started just looking at what are the key things that we need to map for us to move ahead. So now, once you have your M&E strategy, here is some impact that we have been actually able to create. Here are some glimpses of our implementation. The top thing that you see here is actually planning the business model. So we created scenarios like, if you had a shop, what would that look like? Now, before we even jumped to that, the key aspect we had to remember was starting where they are. So before we even addressed this, we gave them an exercise, which was, if you were to create a dish, what are the things you do? What are the steps you'd follow? So when they started looking at, I would have to go buy vegetables, or even make a list of the vegetables I need. I would have to get the utensils that I need. From there to, washing my dishes and cleaning my kitchen once it's done. So we asked them to actually map out that journey, because that was something they would easily relate with. So once they had that, and when we asked them to create this business model, it was very easy for them to change that lens and look at it holistically. And for Meri Hunar, we didn't even have to actively nudge a lot. They were able to come up with a lot of the things themselves. They would not have known the proper term for it, but they knew that this job had to be done. So again, going back to the conversation, that it's very important to start where they are and make everything you're doing relatable. That just again accelerates the impact you're trying to create. Again, our WhatsApp group started seeing long messages, heartfelt messages. They started sharing information even about their personal life. They started giving shout outs to each other, started sharing their consultation numbers each month. So that also happened because we were creating a safe space. Now, here is basically the prompt that we'd given them to be able to do the recipe exercise before we moved on to Meri Hunar. And lastly, interactive things that we keep making them do. The thing that you see here was us helping them create a template so that they could go reach out to their suppliers and actually get the information. The reason we did this was, again, starting where they are. Even if we would give them a template, for them to print it out was not possible. So what we did is we created a foldable paper method where they'd create something that was like a table, and they could take it across and just fill the information that was required. One thing we keep going back to is it's really important to start where they are and then handhold them through the entire envisioned impact. And initially, it is very important. And once you start including them in the process and the guided holistic support that they require, you'll already see that sense of ownership, the motivation go higher, and your role will keep changing from, guided and holistic support to just nudging once in a while. But to get there, doing this exhaustively and extensively is very, very important. So here is actually a glimpse of the impact that we were able to create. Since majorly we've spoken of three gaps in this conversation that we were able to address. First was medical information retention. So after the first 3 months, we actually asked them, whatever information we send to you, is it easy to understand? We knew just asking that was not enough. We also asked things like, how does it help you? How much are you even able to retain? Are you able to retain, little information? Are you able to retain everything that we're sharing? Or are you able to retain a lot of what we are sharing? And the fourth option was none. We are not able to retain any information. So when we actually did that, we got an idea of how well or how much do we need to break it down further. So again, not necessary, because here you see 25% is saying a little is all I can remember. So here you take a call like, is this TG a minimal number or something that I have to address to? The next conversation I would have with this 25% is why. Is it because they are unable to give it time? Is it because, the information that we're sharing is complex? So that would be the approach I would take to understand how I can even reduce that percentage further. The third thing we also asked was what kind of formats they enjoy. So these are some common things that we keep asking every month to them as well to make sure we're really aligned. We asked the formats that they really enjoyed so we could keep sending those out in regular interventions. Second thing that majorly we were addressing was, let's say, low self confidence, right? So, in the beginning, before we began the program, we'd sent it out where we asked them, what is your confidence level? So, as you can see, over 75% were two or below. And after we were actually done with first month of the entire workshop, which is 3 months after the intervention was introduced, we had over 70% say that they were 4 and above in terms of overall confidence. The third thing where we created an impact actively was interaction within the community in the safe space. So again, we asked them questions like, firstly, do you feel close to the people that are in your program itself? And we also asked them one subjective question, which was who and why. So this would give us a little qualitative data as well as to who they're really connected to, and again, if we could identify any patterns, which was like, if it is because they're mothers, is it because of the age factor? So what is really enabling these kind of relations? So we could again feed back into our insight and strategy and actually use it to our advantage to accelerate the impact that we're creating. I will take a pause here, and yeah, this is one of the ways you could build capacity, and I will leave the stage open for any questions, any sort of further clarity in any of the aspect or any conversation that you'd like for me to dive deeper into.
Ankita, I think we do have a couple of questions in the chat box if you could go there.
I would just a sec. First is, hi Ashish, your question is how does the social enterprise engage your service for a program/initiative? So, like we mentioned, the example that we took was of our sort of collaboration with the social enterprise. This is very customized based on what the social enterprise is really even looking at. So here they wanted us to be able to understand, even after implementing the medical training, why are they unable to see the impact? So we really advocate for research first approach where we're able to even validate whether that problem statement is correct or no, because a lot of the times what you think is the problem may not really actually be the problem. So first, irrespective of what the inquiry is, we do a basic research and understand if that really is the problem and what your goals or visions are, so we could come back to you with that data and what are some strategies. So here again, based on the community, we were able to pick up, okay, these are the things that need to go ahead. These models in terms of business model, it's more of a retainer model where it's divided into stages. So even after the research, if you think this is not relevant, you can take a call in the direction that you'd want to go ahead in. Second, I think it's a follow-up question. We're working on ambitious, resilient livelihood programs in Sundarbans, and that has to be long-term sustainable for the local communities and not a short-term project approach. Correct. So here again, if you look at it, capacity building anyway cannot be a short-term approach because they will constantly need to upgrade. There was survival, there was thriving, and there was also, the instinct that we were talking about. So for that, you have a partner. So for example, right now our role is slowly changing with the first batch of the women that were a part of our program. So now no longer do we need to do this, but it's more catch-up, weekly catch-up calls and just how we change the nudges. Similarly, for you, either you could implement it internally or you could have somebody somebody who's doing this for you, where you're understanding what are the stages. Because again, evolution won't happen in one go, right? You'll start with basic, let's say knowledge retention nahi ho raha hai, so you'll start there. Then you will slowly move ahead to, okay, now knowledge retention is happening, but application may be still an issue. So how do I make sure I'm able to apply it? Now once application has happened, you will look at, okay, now how do I look at it from an even bigger perspective, which is the society level? How can they even scale this? So it completely depends on where your community is, and slowly they themselves will be at a space where, the entire alumni engagement comes in, which means you've already built the capacity of a couple of batches who now have the ability to be able to help the other new people who are going to be joining the program. So the long term vision is that, but this does take around at least a year and a half to 2 years for you to get at a stage where your first batch can actually give back to their community from a training perspective. Does that answer your question? Was that of help? I'm going to take that as a yes. Thank you so much, Mamta. I hope you genuinely enjoyed the session and this is of some help. And please feel free to reach out to us, even if it's just for a short conversation. Happy to be able to connect and actually have a talk around the kind of communities you're working on and what are some approaches that you could take to create the impact. For sure, Ashish, we'd love to connect as well. We'll share our information. Radisha, could you just help me with sharing our information on the chat quickly? Yeah. So if there are no further questions, I think we can take a pause there. And thank you so much, guys, for attending and actually sitting through this entire your organization into providing strategy development support. Yes, so we also build capacity for organizations internally. Our last one was with Mantra for Change, where we actually help them. They work with basically government stakeholders to implement strategies at a school level. So we helped their internal team in terms of how they could create better strategies to accelerate impact. So we do have capacity building sessions for organizations as well, personalized and customized workshops done for them and their program and initiatives. Thanks, Rashi. And yes, I think patience is the key. That needs patience and time for sure. This is something we keep advocating, that change is slow. So it is, taking baby steps and seeing this over time. And you do see results for sure. I think in the first 3 weeks itself, you'll see when they start opening up, even if it doesn't show in numbers. So one key thing we keep with ourselves as well is, because impact is very difficult to measure, right? How do you quantify how you've even impacted a personal life? Everything that we've shown is just tiny matrix, but how do you say, I've made this person's life better by 80%, 20%? So yeah, I think patience is definitely the key, and we're still figuring out how do we even capture the impact that we create. And I think this is a problem across sector. So yeah, slowly but surely there'll be change. We can close the session here. Thank you so much again, guys, for attending this. It was lovely to be here and actually share what we've been working on. Happy to connect with anybody who'd like to have a conversation, co create impact in any manner, or collaborate on anything that they're working on. We don't limit ourselves to, the kind of topics we're working around. We love to explore anything, but our definitely expertise is education, healthcare, SRHR, and around those things. Thank you.